Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, Jeff Peterson gives an outlook for planted acres in 2017. Justin McMechan describes corn ear formation issues in 2016. Jay Parsons discusses decision-making in the downturn. And Bruce Anderson talks about forage issues. Jeff Peterson from Heartland Farm Partners is our market analyst this week. U.S. farmers planted more soybean acres in 2016 than ever before. The 83.7 million acres of beans was about 1 million more than a year ago. Corn growers put in 94.5 million acres, which was the most since 2013. The American wheat area of 50.1 million acres, meanwhile, was the lowest since 1970. Jeff joined us recently to look ahead to the 2017 planting season and how those numbers might shift as spring approaches. Jeff, as we start to look at 2017, where are costs for productions and profitability here for corn and soybeans?
Yeah, this year's all over the board, Jeff, and as we look at it, for guys who are really good at planting soybeans, and based off those good yields, they're looking at beans and saying, you know what, I like these prices, but most of our guys like corn. And even though corn isn't at break even, and honestly for probably 75% of our people, beans aren't at break even right now either, they still like planting those corn acres on most of the acres.
How does the cost of production impact what acres we might see planted in 2017?
I think that comes into be a big way this year. As you sit back and hear a lot about kind of the cash flow and the situation, the conversations with lenders, that's going to come up a lot. And if there's going to be a change in acres, which we do think there will be, it is going to be driven by the costs. We think that the lenders are going to snug up some people's balance sheets. They're going to snug up their budget and cause them, in many cases, maybe on those corn acres, maybe to cause some of those guys to have to switch over to beans. Also, some of the guys that maybe are a little bit tighter on finances, they're going to have to switch over to some bean acres also.
Tell me the range that you're looking at here, and we're early, so I'm not going to hold you to a specific number here, but the window where you think that we could see corn and bean acres go.
Yeah, what it looks like, the market, I'll start there first, is kind of looking for 3 to 4 million acres, kind of is what the market's looking at. We don't think that's necessarily based on what the farmer's going to do. Our own personal numbers would say, let's bring corn acres down about 2 million. Let's bring bean acres up about 2.5 million. Some of those acres that, as you look at those, aren't balanced. Some's going to come from wheat. We also think you're going to have to take some of the acre reduction in the corn and take it over prevent plant. Just because as we compare to last year, prevent plant numbers were a little bit lower than what you would normally see.
That would include a big scale up for soybeans, which we already saw last year. Can you explain where that demand is coming from while Brazil is still planting big crops?
Yeah, no, and the biggest thing about that is as we look back to production last year, Brazil was off, or South America more correctly was off on their production. Not a lot though, so we picked up some demand from that, but as we go into the 17 crop, it really comes back to China. We're getting year over year growth on the bean demand of about 4 to 4.5%. And really most of that's coming from the demand that China still has for the soybeans, which that's great.
Paint the bigger picture of what's happening down in South America.
Yeah, as we take a look at South America, first of all, starting in Argentina, they're still planting. They've been a little bit dry because the little La Nina pattern that we've had out there is giving a little dryness. It looks like they're going to see a little bit of a pattern change in here though. Looks like they're going to pick up some better rains. However, now Brazil is starting to get a little bit dry. Overall, we're going to see production increase there on both the corn and bean side as we bring Brazil and Argentina together.
Right, and Brazil, it appears, is committed to increasing both corn and bean acres.
You know, they really are. They have the acres, they have the infrastructure. We're going to have to watch this dollar versus real relationship very, very close. The strong dollar, you'd all of a sudden say, well, is that helping or hurting us? And overall, I would say that it's hurting us. It's giving us a headwind. But if for some reason we'd see the real increase down there, then in that case, then that would potentially come back to help us. Now, we don't think that's going to be the case, but that's something we have to watch for.
Where are world stocks at right now?
Well, world stocks, the best way to say it, Jeff, is that we've got enough stocks out there to keep a lid on the price, but we don't have so many stocks out there that a weather problem in Argentina, Brazil, the United States, the Ukraine, somewhere couldn't cause us to bounce, higher in price. And in particular, what we're really saying is the fact that going into next year is the important thing. We do think we're going to see stocks on a stocks to use basis increase on both corn and soybeans.
You had hinted at this earlier, but how competitive will acres be for wheat, alfalfa, sorghum, cotton, the crops that normally you wouldn't see prominently in Nebraska?
Yeah, I think what that's going to come up is they're the others. And what I mean by that is they're going to take a little bit of acres in each individual situation, because when we drove this price up, we pulled acres away from those different areas. And now that we're bringing prices back down, those are areas that there's going to definitely be some acres that are going to slide off to. No one in particular, but they'll slide off to all of them.
Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to look at cattle markets. Nebraska corn growers experienced some ear formation issues during the 2016 season that were so unusual, their cause hasn't yet been determined. Farmers noted short husks, dumbbell-shaped ears, and multiple ears per node. Justin McMechan is part of a Nebraska Extension team trying to find the reason or reasons behind those issues. As Justin notes, Nebraska Extension educator Jenny Reese first noticed the problems in her area of south central Nebraska. Those were eventually confirmed in other areas of the state and Midwest as well. Justin joined us recently to describe what the ear formation issues looked like and explain how the team is trying to find their causes.
Yeah, so we initially got some reports in early August from Jenny Reese, and Jenny alerted us to some unusual ear development issues that were occurring, and so we went out and toured the fields and found some stuff that Roger Elmore, who's been an agronomist here for quite a few years, hasn't seen. And so initially we started looking through these, and we tied them back to several different stages of development as far as our hypothesis on when stress might have occurred. And initially we thought this was really confined to Nebraska, so we were fairly confident that some extreme weather events, and a wind event specifically on July 7th may have been the cause of this. But then talking with other states later, we found out that it was actually occurring in those states as well from some very credible resources. And so that really kind of debunked our wind event. We're not letting go of it as a possibility, but it certainly leans the idea to some large impact across a wide region. And those states were Iowa, Illinois, Kansas, down to Texas. And so we kind of started reevaluating this. We quickly pulled together and did a large collection across Nebraska, mostly focusing on the southeast part of the state, and collected from 16 fields. And now we're really going through trying to sort out, by internodes and a lot of different characteristics on the plants themselves, as well as grower practices and planting dates and things like that, to try and figure out if there's some commonality in all these fields with the ear development issues.
Let's talk about the three that you're noticing here. Short husks, tell me what the problem was.
Yeah, so short husks, as far as we know from corn development, that's usually occurring between V15 and V18. That's just prior to tasseling. That's when we expect those husks to be elongating, and they remain relatively short. And I should note that some hybrids do show shorter husks, not to the extreme that we saw in this case, but it does help with dry down, so it can be a positive thing to have some short husks. But in this case, we're talking a third of the entire length of the ear in some cases, and so it left that ear exposed to a lot of different pathogens that could show up, and insect and bird feeding. And so as a result, that exposed ear, I think, suffered a lot through the remainder of the season.
Let's talk about the dumbbell-shaped ears.
Yeah, the dumbbell-shaped ears are kind of a unique one. I think that it was particularly surprising to all of us, including the more experienced. But basically, we have an ear that had kernel formation towards the bottom, and then at some point that kernel formation stopped, and we have an inner cob that's quite small. And that really linked us back to that V12 to V15 stage when we'd expect silks to be elongating. So no silks elongated in this case, and left this blank space where there's no seed present. But then past that, we do get so we do get the presence of kernels again. So it's kind of this unusual thing. We saw variations of that where there was no seed formation at the bottom of the ear as well as at the top. And so, it presents kind of a conundrum because it suggests that this occurred at several different stages, whether or not those plants were at different stages of development or not. But that one's a little bit unusual for us.
Let's talk about the last one, multiple ears per node.
Yeah, multiple ears per node I'm a little more familiar with. So this one, and in the case of all of these actually, we currently hypothesize it's the loss of the primary ear. So we'd expect a primary ear to be present, and it was lost sometime during the development stages. And these are all secondary ears. That's what we hypothesize. And our initial data that's coming out is suggesting that. But multi-ears really points to that. And basically we lose this primary ear even beginning as early as the V6 stage, so when these plants are quite small. And as a result, we get hormones that push down the plant and cause all these ears to form. And so you can get a number of ears all the way down, in fact, to the soil level. And the reason I'm more familiar with this one is we did a study in 2015 where we removed the primary ear just after it formed. We could get this nice multi-ear development, not nice in the terms of what growers would want, but in the terms of identifying the causes for research, it certainly points to primary ear loss. The fortunate thing with multi-ears is they really don't produce any seed because they're off sync from when we'd have pollen being distributed throughout the field. So they're a heavy yield impact when they occur.
Describe what this damage was in terms of severity and yield.
Yeah, it varied a lot, and that'll help us identify what the potential causes might have been. But we saw fields with 70 to 80% of a range of the abnormal ears that I just described. And then in other cases down to 20% in a few fields that showed no symptoms at all. So that'll really help us identify potential factors that might be linked to an individual field to isolate this.
So if a grower's watching this, they see something familiar that they thought they might have had in their field, what do they do?
Yeah, even though we're after harvest, we can't collect any more from those fields. We'd really like to know, especially if they took photos on this, because it'll help us identify areas that were impacted. And because we're looking at things like temperature that we can get a large amount of data on, a yes or no response from an individual field would help us determine which factors might be responsible.
Where do you guys go from here on this research?
Yeah, this is definitely a long-term project. So I think from here we're going to hopefully identify a list of factors that might be responsible, and then we'll start isolating those and see if we can recreate the conditions that were responsible for this. So I see this as a multi-year process. We're hoping to give growers an indication of the cause and potential causes, or a list, because that's essentially will help them with a bit of risk management in the future. But unfortunately, things like this, when there's so many different things that are showing up in the field, it will take us a while to sort it out.
Nebraska Extension personnel will further discuss this issue at the crop production clinics coming up next week in several locations across the state. You can find more information about those, as well as contact information for Justin, through links on the Market Journal website. The Fremont Corn Expo will be held this Thursday, January 5th at Christensen Field in Fremont, Nebraska. The event is free to attend and includes breakfast and lunch. It begins at 7:30 and runs until 3 o'clock. Nebraska Extension educator Nathan Mueller explains why a grower might want to attend this year's expo.
We're going to provide a whole bunch of information that will help them make those critical management decisions with the type of speakers we invited that are really based on last year's feedback from people who attended the expo. First up in the morning is going to be Dr. Joe Luck, a precision ag engineer, talk about multi-hybrid planting and some of the research they've done this year, how to prepare yourself as a grower for that technology. Then we'll have Brent Gloy, an ag economist, visiting professor at Peru, talk about the economic outlook. Then we'll have a quick panel before lunch that will really look at ag finances. After lunch we'll have Charles Shapiro, soil fertility professor, talking about phosphorus management. And then we'll finish up the day with Brian Smith from the National Weather Service talking about extreme weather. The feedback we've gotten is something that they want to attend every year. They'd recommend it to other people. And that's really because the speakers are based on those evaluations that people attended last year said, we'd really like to hear about this or this. And so all these speakers are in line with what growers want to hear about. And that's how we base what the speakers are the next year.
Again, the Fremont Corn Expo is free to attend and sponsored in part by the Nebraska Corn Board. You can find more information about the event at croptechcafe.org. The December Nebraska Farmer says most corn and soybean growers are familiar with the USDA's corn and soybean yield estimates. This month's issue says many farmers know there will likely be some difference between the first and final projections. Nebraska Extension's Nathan Mueller, a cropping systems educator in Dodge and Washington counties, has been experimenting with a new method to tighten the gap between those numbers. Last year, his estimates came within 2 bushels for the USDA's final numbers in Dodge County. You can read more about his method for calculating yields in the December Nebraska Farmer. In late November, the Nebraska Department of Agriculture and UNL's Department of Agricultural Economics released a report on the financial health of farms in the state. Their survey was mailed to producers in July. Its results showed more than 3/4 were worried they might not be able to get the necessary operating capital within the next year. More than half of the respondents said they were financially stressed. Nebraska Extension economist Jay Parsons described parts of the survey at the Market Journal Roadshow earlier this year. We talked with him at Nebraska Innovation Campus about the report and how farmers and ranchers think about decision-making during the downturn.
Yeah, we conducted the survey in the summer of 2016. July was when most people were filling it out. And the main purpose of the survey was to see what the mood was out there, see what the financial stress was and whatnot.
Yeah, what did the results show?
Well, we saw that there is some stress out there. Not surprisingly, some people are experiencing some low prices and are a little bit worried about obtaining credit and whatnot. One of the things that I looked at was, within that population that said they were experiencing stress, what did they look like? And, a lot of them were younger producers without a lot of equity. And that, as an educator of young people looking to go back into farming and ranching, that was a concern to me.
One of the things that you presented on during the Market Journal Roadshow was how a producer makes decisions. So with the Farm Financial Survey, could you tell whether or not producers were altering or planning to alter the decisions that they would normally make during the course of a year?
Well, we asked them what they planned to do about things, and one of the things that they said was they were going to defer machinery replacement, and that's not surprising. That's been done throughout time, and so not a shock there necessarily. But the other thing one of the other questions we asked them was about adoption of new technology, and the majority of them also said they were going to continue to be aggressive adopters of new technology, and of course those two are not exactly compatible with one another. So as people adjust to these financial times, obviously they're going to be having to make some difficult decisions and looking at some trade-offs there.
Can you tell that people are changing their objectives during this downturn?
You can't tell that because a lot of people don't actually state their objectives. They don't do a good job of diligently thinking about what they're really trying to accomplish. They keep it up in their head, or at least that's what they tell you. But at the same token, I talk to producers all the time that they'll tell you, I just want to make good money, and then at the same time they're trying to tell you that they want to secure the farm for the next generation. And of course there's obviously some trade-offs there, right? They can't make all the money and still bring in the next generation very well. They got to accommodate them somehow. And so obviously, there's some work to be done there in terms of articulating their objectives and getting them squared away and making sure that they understand exactly all the things they're trying to achieve.
Since you teach on this subject and you've researched it a lot, what do you think producers should know about decision making and kind of what impacts their decisions as they go forward this year?
Well, the big thing is getting those objectives in line. And if it's a family operation, they have their objectives, but there's also the family objectives, and making sure people are clear on things that they're trying to accomplish there. The other thing is to understand that there's tons of uncertainty in the world, and certainly agriculture is one of the most uncertain environments to work in and to make a living. And just be realistic about it. Even though a lot of people don't plan because they don't like to be wrong, and in any place with a lot of uncertainty, you map things out, and one thing I can guarantee is you're going to be wrong about something tomorrow. You're going to look back and something has changed. So get over that, make those plans a living document, communicate it well throughout your operation, and really focus on things that you're trying to get done.
You can find results from the Farm Financial Health Survey through a link on the Market Journal website. Nebraska Extension forage specialist Bruce Anderson says even though hay might be cheaper for livestock producers this year, losing some to waste can still add up and impact tighter margins. We talked with Bruce recently about reducing loss by changing feeding practices and using different kinds of feeders. We started by asking how big of a problem hay waste could be.
Well, it can be a pretty big problem. A lot of times we kind of want to get the animals fed and get out of there and get done with that kind of job there. But if we don't do it properly, the animals really will waste an awful lot of that hay. We've got some research that shows that if you just put out enough hay there that you think the animals will take care of for about 4 or 5 days, that they might waste as much as 45% of that hay, maybe causing you to need to feed 25-30% more hay over the season than what you would if you gave them a little bit more care, a little bit more restricted access to that hay.
Yeah, what's the better way to do it?
Well, there's a number of better ways. You know, there's things that we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid things like the animals eating too much. We're trying to avoid the animals fouling their hay, trampling it, trying to avoid them using it for bedding rather than a feed supply. So really things that we can do to try and keep them from getting it out in the ground and have access to their feet and hooves is the things that we're looking at. One of the ways to do that is to use various hay racks or bale rings that restrict the access of the animals to that hay so they can't just crawl all over it. And especially useful is if we're using those types of barriers that they have kind of a solid barrier at the bottom, so that the animals can't stick their hooves in, which they typically will do in an open area, pull out some of that hay, and that hay that they pull out, if they don't have it in their mouth, it usually goes underfoot, and as a result, we end up losing it in those situations.
In terms of times of feeding, would you rather people feed once a day or once every couple days instead of once 4 or 5 days?
From a stretching out of the hay supply, certainly feeding them once a day is a much more effective way of doing it. Now, sometimes labor-wise, we may need to do multiple days, and from a strict nutrition standpoint, oftentimes we can get by with doing it every 2 or 3 days. But if you're trying to save some money from the standpoint of how much hay you're feeding, and even though hay prices are down this year compared to the last couple years, our margins are even tighter. So we don't want to waste some of that money on the hay that we don't need to. So daily feeding will really stretch it out much more fully.
How much of a difference in waste can there be if you're using racks versus rings versus some other type of holding equipment?
Well, oftentimes we'll see that if we have used something with the appropriate solid barrier on the bottom and compare that to one that has an open bottom, we may save 10 to 15% in terms of our hay. And that starts to add up pretty quickly in terms of dollars over the course of a full winter. Another thing that a lot of folks do, though, however, instead of using bale rings and racks and stuff like that, they do feed the hay on the ground. That's not unusual at all. And whether we're going to be doing that with ground hay, loose hay, unrolling bales and stuff like that, one way to really help reduce a lot of the waste that can occur there is to, one, only put down enough that the animals will clean up in one quick meal. And secondly, set up some kind of a barrier so they only have access to that hay on one side. You know, you could use an electric fence, or if you're up around the farmstead, you could unroll those bales or the loose hay right along a wall or something like that, that keep the animals from having access to get to that hay from both sides and trampling and laying down and wasting a lot of that material.
Any way to ensure that all cows have equal access here and the big girls don't take charge?
Well, the trick to that is making sure that you're putting out enough hay and having it spread out wide enough so that everyone can get access to it at the same time. Otherwise, the problem that you mentioned there, Jeff, certainly can be a challenge to deal with, and we'll have some problems that way.
Now, with this week's weather outlook, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here we are for the weekly forecast, or what we normally would have for a weekly forecast with the university shut down for the holidays. We're going to give you a kind of an update of the conditions we see across the globe and in the United States in regards to what potentially may come down the pipeline this winter. Of course, we didn't really go into winter very well. We basically had a very warm fall. In fact, by all accounts, the second warmest fall on record. And then all of a sudden, we just went into winter. And unfortunately, we haven't had enough systems move across the country to get a good feel on what the overall storm track is, although the early hints are that systems will eject out of the western United States and then move up through the Central Plains into the upper Midwest, and primarily the heaviest snowfall accumulation associated with this pattern tends to be across the Dakotas and the Great Lakes regions. If we start to see more Arctic intrusions into our region, then of course we would expect to see a much farther southern storm track and have the potential to impact more of the Central Plains, including Nebraska and Kansas. More importantly, we're paying particular attention to the ongoing La Nina event in the equatorial Pacific and its implications. But before we get to that, let's take a look at what the latest drought monitor is showing. And if we look at that latest drought monitor, the one thing I'll draw your attention to is that we do have drought that's starting to intensify to our south of us, particularly through Oklahoma. But the core area, the worst of the drought, is in the southeast. Now, this has had some relief with the previous systems that have moved across, particularly on the northern extent and the northwestern extent of this dry area. But as you get into the core in Alabama, portions of the western North Carolinas and into northern Florida, we have an extensive dry area. And under La Nina conditions, this is an area that tends to see below normal precipitation. So I expect that we will see some portion of this signature existing as we get into the spring months. But more importantly, we're paying attention to this region to see if we see an expansion. With these systems coming out in a regular fashion, there's a possibility we could actually see some improving conditions, particularly as we get into the spring period, but we'll have to wait and see how that bears out. If we look at what the drought monitor folks are thinking, they think that this area is going to persist, but pay attention to this portion of the equation, how they calculate this. They're basically indicating that they don't expect more than a 1 category reduction in this area, and that's why they're saying with the persistence of the drought. So we do see improving areas in the northern portion of this region, but an expansion of dryness issues in eastern Texas is forecasted, and no significant relief for this area in California. Personally, I think that some of these systems that are moving down the western coast are going to give them at least a 1 category reduction, and we'll wait to see whether or not the category reductions past that are more importantly showing us an improving conditions in the southwest. But this is an area that's been persistent with dryness issues for the better part of the last 6 years. Now, as we look at the equatorial Pacific, here's our La Nina pattern, a very weak pattern, barely quantifies for La Nina. And if we look at the oscillation, or the southern oscillation, basically the pressure differential from Tahiti to Darwin, that is really not even indicating La Nina conditions. So this event is not at this point in time expected to last past the early spring period, and only about 15% of the models indicate that this could last into the summer. More importantly, this is the area paying attention to. The northern Pacific has cooled down with an active weather pattern, bringing up the upwelling of the cold water from the below to the surface, and that is indicated with an intensely cold pocket, and we have warm Atlantic. If this pattern continues, where we have a cold Pacific and a warm Atlantic, that would indicate that we have an increased drought risk across portions of western Nebraska and the eastern Corn Belt.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on corn and soybean acres in 2017, corn ear formation issues, decision-making during a downturn, and forage recommendations. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next week, Mike Briggs will join us to look at cattle markets, and Roger Elmore will talk about using cover crops in corn and soybean production systems. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.